You'll have to excuse me if I become incoherent and you read it later on the website. It's not that there's something wrong with the website. I've had 1/2 hour of sleep between the time I left the States and I'm here now. And that's because there were some really great movies on the airplane. This, as Monique said, this is not or Tracy said, this is not my first time in Amsterdam, but my very first time was when I was 16, and it occurred because my mother decided this was a very clean country. My father and my brother had died the year before, both of them of brain tumors, and my mother decided that there was some kind of disease, perhaps, in the house, in the soil. And we had something, I don't know whether you probably didn't have it here, it was a cleanser called Old Dutch Cleanser. It was like a little powder, and you used it at the, on your sink. And that's what inspired her. She was cleaning the sink, and she said, Holland is clean. We're moving to Holland. And we sailed on the SS Rotterdam. We landed in Rotterdam, and we had no idea where we were going to live, what school we were going to go to. And it was so unplanned. My little brother and I, we thought it was wonderful. It was a great adventure, but we were literally lost souls. We couldn't read Dutch, of course. My mother hardly spoke English, and we had to eat out of the vending machines. We ended up in Utrecht, where we lived in the YMCA, took a train to Verkoven and then a bus, and I went to a little school there. Wonderful school, castle with a boat and swans swimming around. And eventually we found a place to live took rooms with a woman in Verkoven. Unfortunately, she did not allow us to keep the lights on after 9. And so it was going to be very difficult to become a doctor if I couldn't keep the lights on and study. So we decided that we would leave. And so, but for a light bulb, I could be living in the Netherlands, where it's very, very clean. No, it's much more than that, because when I was 16, I had wanted to be an artist since the age of 7. And so I was enthralled with the great artists. And I had studied art history in high school, and when I arrived in Amsterdam, it was amazing to be in front of the masters, the master paintings. So I'm again going to be in awe when I go to the museums. My books I think of as being about identity. They are certainly about mothers and daughters. I do think they're historical. Romance, I resist if people were to call it a sex novel. It is, I don't know, literary novel is one of these jokes that we have among us writers. And that is, a book is literary when it's incomprehensible or inaccessible to most people, and you make references, cultural references that 90% of the people don't know. So I hope that my book is not literary in that sense. I do think there's a lot of history there. Oh, let's see. Do we have a slide? I feel that often my stories have to do with an underlying question I've had since childhood, sort of a epistemological sense of needing to inquire of myself, who am I? And that is the question of identity. The question, of course, is not answerable. What it generates is more and more questions. And so over time, what I have accumulated is what I call a personal history of these questions, who am I? And it includes curiosity as well as imagination. What I write about then has to do with that history and the imagination, how they intersect with one another. It is about identity and influence, and also love and death. I think that I always wonder if people ask this question of themselves, that who we are from the moment we pass through the birth canal into that very brightly lit hospital room with all the hard edges and no longer the soft, flexible womb. You know, who are we? How did we land in that particular family? And that's what I used to ask myself when I was aware that I was Chinese. You know, how did I land with this Chinese family? And why do I look Chinese? Did I eat too much Chinese food? Did it kind of stack up in my legs and go up to my face? And I'm interested in those questions of what has given us our curiosity, our intelligence, our ability to handle difficulties, the qualities that make us lovable or difficult. What is this mess, in other words, that is the enigma? I call it the enigma of myself. The influence part has to do with how did I become who I am, and Monique mentioned circumstances, and part of that includes who we're born to. If I had been born to, say, an Italian family who for generations had fruit orchards, who would I have been? And that, by the way, is the family of my husband, who did come from Italy. Or if I had been born and raised in China, as were my sisters. One of my sisters, I found out about 10 years ago, I don't know why I didn't know this before. I was going off to a wonderful place in Guizhou, high in the mountains, to be among rice farmers. And I was staying with my sister in Shanghai, and she said, what's so special about that, you know, that I was going to be with rice farmers? She said, I did that for 19 years. I said, what? She said, yes, I was sent down to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution, and she remained there. And she was one of those peasants in the conical hat, bent over in the rice fields picking leeches off her legs. She also told me that she had been told for so many years what to do that her imagination didn't work anymore. It became rusted. Would that have happened to me? Would I still be the same person I am today, you know, with the intuition I have, or the kind of things I observe, the things that I imagine, the things I obsess about, the fears that I have? Would I have not become a writer if any one thing had happened or not have happened? Like the light bulb, you know, in Verwondering. You know, maybe I would have married a Dutchman or something and stayed here. And maybe I would have been a writer here. Anyway, my question is, how did I become who I am? Now, one of the questions, or one of the things that I've been very curious about is the influence of my family. And obviously, we're influenced by our parents. I've written about this in many of my books, you know, especially the Joy Luck Club, the influence of my mother and my resistance to that influence many times. And I found that many people identify with that. So I feel that, for example, from her I got a lot of my sense of indignation when somebody is condescending toward me, a kind of rebelliousness that is, you know, against conformity. I feel that I have a very bad streak of being not very forgiving. And I am incredibly angry by betrayal. And I think that these are all things that my mother had, that it used to make me quite uncomfortable that she was this way. And of course, all of these things come up in me. Now, if you think that you are influenced by your mother, even in a reactionary way in which you want to become the opposite, and oftentimes are unable to be so, doesn't it then follow that she was influenced by her mother? So I want to know who this woman was that had passed along these same qualities to my mother. What were the circumstances and the experiences that led to some of the attitudes, the intuitions, the fears? Next slide, please. So I've been pondering this generational history of personality, attitudes, emotions, even food preferences. In our family, we love crisp, crunchy things. And I think of my grandmother as having loved that too. Much has been passed along, and I know that. My grandmother, however, someone I didn't get to know, she died in 1925. My mother hardly got to know her. But I have discovered something recently that struck me as a need to re-examine my whole sense of who I am and how did I become the person I am. Next slide. My grandmother, as I said, she died at age 36 in 1925. She killed herself. Before she killed herself, she had become the fourth wife of a very rich man. She had been the first wife of a scholar who died during the pandemic. But eventually she became this fourth wife, which she felt was a disgraceful position. She is in this photo a few months, probably 2 months before she delivered a son, my mother's half-brother. Some of the things that my mother taught me are these ideas, these principles. And again, I'm thinking of my grandmother as I tell you what these principles are. She said, don't let anyone determine your self-worth. Your worth is not another person's opinion. If someone looks down on you, you can go higher and look further down on them. Be independent, able to leave a situation like a marriage or a job. Don't be fooled by fake people who are there only to flatter you when they want something. Know what loyalty is. Not those who are your friends only when times are good. Don't seek popularity. Don't get lost into thinking popularity makes you a better person and less popularity makes you worse. Follow your own mind. Don't let others tell you what to think or do. Now, as I said, my grandmother killed herself at age 36, and I want to know what was the life that preceded this decision. As I said, she lived in a, next slide please. She lived in she married to a rich man and she lived in a mansion that was on an island called Chongmingdao, which is just outside of Shanghai. I was told by my uncle and that side of the family that she was old-fashioned, traditional, stay-at-home mother, forced to become this concubine because she was raped, very had felt that her life was one of perpetual shame, told her daughter, don't be like me. And my favorite picture of my grandmother, because of her hard life and her inability to speak for herself, she became the reason, my muse, for a lot of my writing that I did. And so I have a favorite picture that sits on my desk. Next slide, please. She looks very dreamy-eyed, very innocent, and I thought perhaps this is a photo taken on her wedding day or just before. My grandmother, in some ways, I felt had given me things as I would be writing, coincidences. Like if I was thinking that I needed to find out if a certain minority lived in an area of China, suddenly the doorbell would ring and FedEx would be there with a book, the new one by Jonathan Spence, and I'd open it up and the first page I turned to is something about Hakkas living in the area that I was looking at. It was that kind of thing that made me feel that these coincidences weren't merely coincidences, but gifts and an acknowledgement that I was on the right track. So I had this photo of my grandmother, my favorite photo, and was struggling with a book I'd been working on for a number of years. I had seen an exhibit on Shanghai at the museum, and it included something about the role of courtisans. Courtisans were not quite, they were in the continuum of the sex trade. They would be at the very top. But they were in the sex trade because sex eventually became part of what they provided. They were courted. They were... They got to choose who they would provide their intimate favors with. They were very influential in fashion. They lived in very lavish houses. And their careers started at a very early age, say 15, 16, and it was over by their early 20s. A very short, glamorous life. So I was very curious about the life of courtesans, being told that they were very influential, strong women, business women. It's the kind of woman I like to read about. And I bought a book on Shanghai. And as I turned the pages, I saw a picture that stopped my heart. It was a picture of a woman wearing clothes identical to my grandmother. Next picture, please. As you can see, that this woman is wearing a headband that is rather elaborate. It probably has some pearls and embroidery in it. It's a very high-collared jacket. It has tight sleeves, a tight bodice. There are tight pants. You can't see them in this photo. And what's also significant, she's holding a flower, a symbol of her profession, and it is taken in a Western photo studio, studios that were provided only for courtesans. Now, let's go back to that other picture, if we can, and go back to so you see the headband, you see the high collar that goes just below the earlobe, the tight collar, the tight pants, taken in a Western photo studio with pots of flowers all around. I had to think to myself, could this possibly be? And so I began to read a lot about courtesan culture. And there was a little check mark. There were two sides. No, impossible. Maybe. Very strong evidence. So it wasn't just the clothes. There were a number of things I started to piece together about family history, things I'd been told on one side and things I'd been told on the other. That took me into that courtesan world and made me want to stay there. Now I'll show you another picture, if we can move forward past the woman who was the most popular courtesan in 1910. To these 10 beauties, there are actually 10 of them, and I only put in a few of them, but you can see they're all wearing the same outfit. So one of the questions I had about this being kind of a one-off or popular kind of dress, or would a girl go to a place like this? These are all courtesans. Again, my heart is pounding as I look at this. I thought maybe she had gone in there as a lark, remembered family wasn't wealthy, she had to sell clothes to buy clothes for her kids. And then I found more photos that I had never paid much attention to. Next slide, please. They were the size of a postage stamp, and when I enlarged them, I saw how significant they were, because the posture is not old-fashioned, not traditional. And the clothes are quite, they're not traditional either. There are some other details here, the radical hairstyle, which didn't become accepted until around 1917, and in a much more modified, conservative way. There are matching bracelets also in the other picture. A number of details that made me, again, compile a list of evidence. Next picture, please. But the one thing that struck me as most interesting was her attitude. This look that was almost a sneer, a look of disdain, of strength, of attitude, that no matter what had happened to her, what had caused her to be in this situation, had she been a courtesan, she could rise above it, and somehow she would survive. By the way, the way that many of the courtesans started this is that they were kidnapped or sold by a relative, or their families had suddenly been devastated, then made impoverished. And so in order to make a living, sometimes mothers turned to prostitution, and if they were lucky, they landed in a first-class courtesan house. I did actually contact 3 academics. I just was obsessed about this, could it possibly be? And one of them said, I was very insulted, she said, well, by the looks of, the background of this photo studio, it looks like she was actually in a second-class courtesan house. I said, no, not true. I also know that, the photo is not necessarily evidence. There could be all kinds of reasons. I've tried to imagine as many of them as I can, and still it's not enough. I think about myself, there are ways that I look at myself, and if people were to go back 100 years from now or 200 years and dug up evidence on me that I had been this unknown person, they found these photos, on the basis of that photo, would they think that's who I was? Next photo, please. I'm actually in a rock band called the Rock Bottom Remainders, and because I can't sing, the band members made me the lead rhythm dominatrix. I only wear that when I am in this band. I've had a number of, I had a publisher once at one of these book conventions come up to me. He was rather drunk, and he said to Lou, he was very lucky, and then he also told me that he'd been a very bad boy. And I thought, okay. I found pictures of her at a younger age that again made me wonder what had happened in that period of life up until she was older. I saw another photo. Next photo, please. Another photo when she was older, and one of the academics thought that was possibly a maid, and they were often in the pictures. By then, the photo studio is definitely shabby, and so I wondered, at what point did she decide to become the 4th wife of the rich man? So I'm left with this enigma. Next slide, please. This enigma of myself, but also the enigma of my grandmother, and I want to know more because what happened to her and what she felt and how she constructed her life has very much to do with how I constructed my life. My circumstances are different, but somewhere in us is a notion of who we are and how we came to be. Thank you.